In Sunless Zone Zero, when two elements combine into one, it would become disorder! Today I'm gonna teach you a secret tech from Japan, Ijo and Kanton, so you can be the oppai of disorder. No, actually I mean the senpai of disorder. This senpai has no oppai, by the way. I actually see this anomaly and disorder mechanics about a month ago. I thought the content creator in the EN side would do an in-depth guide about it, but I don't really see people talks about this. So yeah, so I'm here to do it myself. So let's go through the basics. So basically when you attack your enemy with different element, it's gonna build up the meters up here. And once you fill that up, it's gonna apply burn, and that is anomaly. And you can see the damage ticking here. It's gonna take 20 times, and that is the debuff of the fire. And for the physical, it applies assault, which gives you a huge chunk of damage and 10% increase of build-up days. It means that you can stun your enemy faster and perform chain attack faster. The ice also gives you a huge chunk of damage, but instead of 10% build-up days, it gives 10% more critical damage. And the other mechanics that I saw in the comment, if you stun the enemy and apply the freeze, it's gonna stop the stun meter. And electrics apply shock, and it's gonna shock enemy for 9 times. It's almost the same with burn, seemingly. Except that if I apply shock here, and if I don't keep attacking it, it's not gonna apply any shock unless I attack it like this. So shock applied for 9 times, so you have to keep hitting the enemy for the next 8 seconds in order to apply all the shocks. And ether also works very similarly to the shocks, but you only have half second to apply the hit, so you have a huge potential loss of damage when you apply ether. I have tried to apply ether, the corruption, multiple times with the characters we have right now, and I gotta say that it's really hard to apply all the hit. So you can see a loss of damage over time in shock and corrupted. But I would say that shock is more applicable than the corrupted, because you have the time window of 1 second per hit in shock, while you have half second per hit on corrupted. And we will talk about it later. Why does it matter in disorder? And normally do benefit from stun multiplier. Like let's say, so my Nekomata and normally damage is 16,000. But if I trigger the anomaly with the stun multiplier, it becomes 24,000. So yes, you could apply the anomaly when your enemy is stunted. And if we stand on the border of other content creator, Guoba and certified it, you can see how much damage it deals on different elements. But one thing I want to talk about the shock is that no matter how I test it, it only triggers 9 times. I don't know is this intentional or is this a bug. I'm testing in 1.1 by the way. Just for the record, all the tests I'm doing right now is at version 1.1. So after you apply anomaly, you would get damage like this. Electrics and ether apply the most total damage, followed with fire, physical, and ice. But in electric, you could lose 20 to 30% realistically if you don't know what you're doing. And you can probably lose 30 to 40% in ether realistically, because the time window is so short to practically get every hit correctly. You can try that with Qingyi, but I still find myself losing 2 or 3 procs in the training ground. You can expect yourself lose even more in a real fight. So what if we trigger disorder on top of that? You would get 17,000 damage from electrics and ether, 1,450 on fire, 1,200 on physical, and 990s on ice if you apply disorder perfectly. And by applying perfectly, it means that you're gonna apply another anomaly on top of an anomaly. If I apply burn, so it's burning now, and I apply another anomaly on top of that, it's gonna create disorder, and disorder do benefit from stun multiplier. So you can see I get 28,000 damage without stun and 42,000 damage with stun. Breaks and disorder. That's a pretty good finding. And when you apply disorder, you will also build up days meter, not by a lot to be honest. By applying perfectly, it means that you're gonna apply the disorder seconds after the initial Anomaly is applied. It's gonna go something like this. So I apply burn and I apply physical the moment after to get the most damage out of it. Not only that, the debuff effect is gonna be overlapping initial debuff. Like in this case, the enemy will be stopped burning and getting the assault debuff instead after trigger the disorder. And the question is, does apply disorder immediately worth it? And the short answer is no, 90% of the time, and maybe 100% in 1.1 version. People assume that the later you apply the disorder, the more damage you're gonna lose. But it's not. For example, if I apply burn on enemy, it doesn't matter if I trigger it the first second or the last second, it's gonna lose zero, absolutely zero damage. The damage on disorder on burning might look lower because the burn has already procced, but in fact you lose absolutely zero damage when you apply disorder, whether you apply it on the first second or the last second. But the other element like physical and the ice, the first second you apply it, the difference of total damage you lost is only 5% if you apply it on the last second. But in ether and electrics, if you apply on the last second, you would lose 14% of damage. And you would also lose 14% if you apply it at the 4-second mark. And on top of that, you have to keep hitting the enemy after you apply the Anomaly to keep the Anomaly proxying. But I would argue that electrics is easier to apply because you only need to hit it once every second. So as I said before, you could only lose up to like 20 to 30% if you don't know what you're doing. And maybe if you want to challenge yourself to deal as little damage as possible, you could lose 65%, but that would be a challenge that deserves an achievement. It's so hard to pull that off when I test it. But in Ether, you have to hit the enemy every 0.5 second, which you can realistically lose about 30 to 40% of damage in practice. So the conclusion is, trigger the disorder of Ether is almost mandatory. Unless they came out with Anomaly characters that has some kind of mechanics to compensate this. But we don't have Anomaly Ether characters anyway, we only have Grace and Piper at the moment. So do you want to trigger the disorder as fast as possible? For Ether, it's almost mandatory for how much potential damage it could lose. And as for fire, it doesn't make any difference at all, whether you trigger disorder in the first second or the last second. And for physical and ice, I would argue that you might be able to get more out of the debuff, like 10% crit damage and a 10% faster build-up speed. And as long as you trigger it, you're gonna benefit the bonus damage from the disorder. And it doesn't matter if you trigger it on the first second or the last second. But as for Ether, you could lose tons of damage. And as for electrics, as long as you trigger the disorder within 4 seconds and keep hitting the enemy every second, you will only lose 7% of damage, and you get to have a more comfortable rotation, which is also important. So it's arguable that it's better to trigger disorder immediately, but you also don't lose much of a damage even if you apply it late. It can only go as much as 15% of total disorder damage plus Anomaly. So we can see that the worst Anomaly team would be Lightning and Ether, because both of them have really high potential to lose chunks of damage if you don't know what you're doing. Zhuyuan and Qingyi team is revolved around the crit damage and the stunning mechanics. So when you're playing this team, you might not want to aim for disorder because it doesn't contribute much to the damage. You should prioritize the rotation to get the stun and the damage out of it. And in my opinion, you can expect a huge damage per screenshot from the electrics. And in my opinion, the strongest Anomaly team in the future would be the combination between the fire element and the electrics element with a little bit of inconsistency. And if you want consistency and high damage, it's gonna be fire and physical, because you can trigger the disorder anytime you want. And goodness gracious, we're gonna get the Anomaly physical. Dando on the next banner, and Fire Anomaly Bernice on the patch 1.2. What a coincidence! So yeah, at this current version, don't stress out about triggering it as fast as possible. Nerd alert! Nerd alert! You wanna min-max everything? Double your effort just to get that 5% extra damage? Yeah, then keep watching. Let's go over the basics of Anomaly damage. So how does Anomaly damage scale? It has to do with your levels, your Anomaly proficiency, your attack, and penetrate ratio. And go for the elemental damage on the disc. So the pen ratio is pretty good on the boss, so generally you wanna have Anomaly proficiency and attacks, but if you get pen ratio, it's still pretty good. And the Anomaly doesn't really crit, and it has a cooldown of 3 seconds. As we can see in this video, it triggered twice in the span of 6 seconds. The other tip that I want to show you guys is that if you have 2 Anomaly characters, you can keep triggering Disorder over and over again. For example, if I keep building different Anomaly on top of each other after they trigger the Anomaly, you would be able to trigger the Disorder on top of each other. Then you get this infinite rotation of Disorder. And not only Anomaly, Disorder also have cooldown time of 3 seconds. And another tip that Guoba Certified also talks about is that you can prevent yourself from triggering Anomaly from just switching characters. If I switch before I hit the enemy, the Anomaly will not be triggered. And you can keep doing this. Okay, never mind, you get the point. And the other tip is, you wanna always trigger the Anomaly of the characters that has higher damage. The characters that has higher Anomaly proficiency. For examples, my Piper has higher proficiency, so I should build physical first, then trigger Anomaly with Soldier 11 because my Soldier 11 has lower damage on Anomaly. Except Electrics and Ether. You wanna trigger the Disorder on Electrics and the Ether first before anything because it simply lost too much damage. Of course, I'm saying that if you're having an Anomaly Ether unit, Electrics unit, the follow-up Anomaly has 0 impact to the initial Anomaly when triggering the Disorder. So you can see I have level 10 Billy and level 50 Piper as comparison. And if I trigger Disorder with Piper here, I would get 62,000 damage. If I use my level 10 Billy to trigger Soldier 11's Disorder, I would get exactly the same number with Piper, which has much higher levels and Anomaly proficiency. So the follow-up Anomaly has 0 impact to the initial Anomaly. And by the way, the Anomaly build-up has nothing to do with levels. It only has to do with Anomaly mastery and the monster type like boss or minion. So your Anomaly build-up speed is exactly the same when you are level 1 or level 60. Anomaly also works independently. So if I build up Anomaly with Nekomata, which has very low Anomaly proficiency, and trigger it with the Piper, then the damage is gonna be really low because the calculation of Anomaly damage are calculated independently. So if I build up Anomaly with Nekomata for 50% and trigger with Piper with another 50%, and the damage gonna end up somewhere in between the initial Anomaly damage of these two characters. So the conclusion is, you wanna build the Anomaly with the characters that has higher stat of Anomaly proficiency. And the same concept can apply to buffing. Anomaly is not snapshotable. So my Nekomata Anomaly damage is 8,000. But if I buff it with Lucy, okay, so we ran out of buff. We take the buff again, and you're gonna get the you're gonna get 16,000 damage as comparison. So what Anomaly damage will I get if I buff Nekomata on the last tick of Anomaly? You will only get buff for the portion that you are hitting with the buff, which you get around 9,000. You are not gonna get the entire buff by doing this. If I build it by half, okay, 60%, and buff it with Lucy again, I would get 12,000. So you only get the anomaly damage for the part you are hitting, so it's not snapshotable. There's no room for cheesing like in Genshin with the hyper broom. I would say this is a quite fair mechanics. Drop a like and sub. See ya guys.